The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar by solutionXchg on preparing for an S/4HANA migration utilization SAP Data Archiving. Utilizing SAP Data Archiving. We're happy you could attend and hope you will find the presentation interesting. My name is Jochen Hager, and I will be your host throughout the session. Up front, a few administrative items. Our presentation today will take about 30 minutes with 5 minutes reserved for questions at the end. A few procedural and technical notes on this. All participants are on mute during the full duration of the webinar. Please post any questions or concerns through the question function in your administration panel on the right side of your screen. If you cannot hear us or cannot see the presentation, please also alert us through the questions panel. We will send out a transcript to those who are interested after the webinar. Please let us know via email to info@solutionXchg.com. Let's dive right into the topic. And our featured speaker today is Dave Rogers, Principal Consultant and Data Archiving Specialist and a long-term partner of solutionXchg. Dave has many years of experience in SAP Data Archiving and has completed many successful projects with clients all over the United States. Dave, please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Jochen. The topic today is preparing for an SAP HANA migration utilizing SAP Data Archiving. So if your company is planning to move to HANA in the future or the near future, then archiving is a critical component to reducing the overall footprint of your system. So all customers approaching HANA must understand that SAP charges for HANA based on total volume. So the more data that you have to process, the more expensive it is going to be. The economics of SAP HANA dictates that customers should shrink the amount of data they put into their HANA system. And this typically starts with putting a value on their specific data, creating a plan to archive older data, rarely used data that is not critical to ongoing real-time operations. Some archiving drivers relating to starting a project would be first and foremost to reduce the total cost of ownership for these new in-memory systems, decreasing downtime during migration. So the less data you have in your production system, quality system, dev system, the shorter time frame it will take to migrate data from that system. Also, database and storage limitation avoidance. So if you're coming to the storage limits for your storage media and your databases, if you go through an archiving project and reduce your overall database size, then you could avoid buying additional hardware and storage and databases to support it. So that is a key driver in this situation. Performance consistency and data storage volume predictability. Performance consistency is if you are archiving on a consistent basis following your corporate retention and residency policies. It means that you can predict what your performance is going to be with your searches and your reporting against your key tables, etc., and during month end and year end close. So keeping a database at a particular size or within range, you can then keep your performance consistent. Legal audit regulatory requirements can be a driver in the situation of relating to archiving. So by compliantly destroying data after long-term retention has been met, which could be 7 years, which is typical for US, Canada. 10 years is more typical for Europe, and maybe even 15 years. If you compliantly and in a controlled way dispose of data after it has met that retention, then you are limiting your risk and your liability for that information to be used against you. Also, from the standpoint of tax and audit, before doing any SAP data archiving project, you need to be aware that you need to perform implement Dart if you haven't already, and run the extracts for your Dart runs to support tax and audit requirements. You could use other third-party solutions like TJC as well to support your auditing needs. But that's always something within a data archiving project that you need to look at, is when you're removing data from the database, you need to make sure that you're not affecting the data that you have available for tax and audit purposes. Sustainable implementations are important. We typically recommend to try to use SAP standard functionality for archiving and for retrieval purposes wherever possible. We know that in certain circumstances you cannot avoid development efforts to archive enable transactions to read from the archive, or you may need to make changes within the archiving programs themselves to maybe suppress some of the checks the programs are doing, or to add additional checks depending on what your business process is and what your definition of a document being officially closed would be. Also, monitor database activity monthly and adapting your approach as needed. So it is important to look at your database activity consistently. If you see any spikes or rises within your tables, then you need to adapt your approach as needed. And also following a utilized, a documented and repeatable process with controls. What that essentially means is you're using a methodology, you're documenting what you're doing, and you continue to repeat that process, and you have controls in place to make sure your archiving is done in a consistent and controlled manner. And also, another key here is to avoid negative impacts on the business. The key to that is to involve your key business users, your decision makers in the testing process. Throughout the project, you want to make sure that they explain to you what their business processes are, and that they test out the retrieval of the data when it's being archived, test out their business processes or their key business process and transactions in the system to make sure that it is not being impacted by the data no longer being in the tables anymore. So that's one of our key goals, is to always avoid negative impacts on the business, and that requires a strong gap analysis process, and it involves the key business users for sure who understand the business. So the data archiving process is shown here graphically. The first step within any data archiving process is executing what we call an archive object. We have archive objects tied to particular documents within your system. There's archive objects, for example, for financial accounting documents, sales orders, purchase orders, etc. So there are hundreds of different archive objects. What they do is they look within the database and target the tables that support that particular document. So the same way that data gets written into the database originally, it's the same way that it gets pulled out of the database. So the first step in any process is based on your selection criteria and your variant within the archive program is to determine what data you're targeting. So as the write program begins, it looks at your variant, determines what data it's going to archive, runs through the checks within the program to determine if that data is in an archivable status. If it is, if it meets all the criteria and all your residency criteria configuration, then it writes that data to an archive file. That archive file was always first written to a file system. So the file system typically mounted to your SAP system, and that could be your final storage space, or that could be just your intermediate location where the data gets stored temporarily before then it would get stored. The next step in the process would be the delete process. The delete process reads the data within the archive files themselves, and then goes within the database and deletes those specific records out of the database. After that, the data gets then written from the file system and pushed out to the storage system. The storage system that SolutionXchg recommends and uses is the KGS system. So we would store the data in the KGS system. The back-end storage media in this case would be the ICAS storage media, and then that would be where your data would reside until the long-term retention has been met, and then the data from within there could be deleted. Retention parameters and things of that nature is all controlled by your storage system. So all of that retention parameters of all the files you write out to KGS is managed from within the tools within KGS. After the data has been stored in the storage system, the data is still accessible to the online system through various transactions that have the ability to read from the archive and various reports that have the ability to read from the archive. Not all the transactions that you use on a day-to-day basis will have the ability to read from the archive, but a good number of transactions are available that have that ability. So that's part of the gap analysis process, is to determine, what transactions and reports you require to read from the archive versus what's comes standard within your SAP system. The archiving concepts as it relates to information lifecycle management, the top section up here really relates to SAP's ILM tool, but we're going to focus on the bottom here as it relates to the lifecycle of data, which will help explain how we come up with the definition of residency time, which means how long the data should remain in the database before it's eligible to be archived, and how to determine the overall retention time. So typically, when data gets created in the system, the access frequency is quite high. As the data is created, it's being changed, the statuses are being changed, etc. Actions are happening against those documents and updates to those documents, etc. So the access is always high. When the access is high, it's not a good time to archive data. The next phase would be where the document is no longer being changed very often. And then the next step would be what we define as a document being business complete. Once a document is termed business complete, then the access typically starts to fall from there. What your residency time is again the time from creation to the time that it's eligible to be archived. So that is a key high-level requirement that needs to be defined for all of your documents you're planning on archiving. Once the data gets archived, moves through the file system to the storage system, it is now sitting in your storage system. The access frequency should be low. There may be spikes because of an audit, a lawsuit, a return, whatever, but they shouldn't be this consistent high access frequency to archive data. If there is, then what you probably should do is change your residency time to be a little bit longer. So we just wanted to give you a picture of the life cycle of typical data within your system and how the frequency changes over time. Now we want to focus on, I guess, considerations, archiving considerations for both process teams and technical teams. So really from a high level statement would be what to archive, how much, and when. So first point here is that the definition of online residency differentiates by org units, document types, company codes, sales orgs, country, etc. So you may not have one residency time for a particular type of document in your system, but you may have differentiating residency times for different organizational units or types of documents in your system. Definition of long-term retention and disposition criteria by organization, country, or regulatory requirement. What we typically see is that we want to segregate our data based on where the data is originating from. Like I explained before, US, Canada may have a 7-year retention where your overseas organization or org units may have a longer retention time. So when we're doing our runs, we want to segregate the data based on country would be a critical component here. Timing for archiving and frequency of archiving are two important factors. Timing, you may consider to do archiving, for financial data 3 months after a fiscal year end. Frequency of archiving really depends on how much data you're archiving. If you have huge volumes of data, if you're in a retail organization or you have a huge number of iDocs, you may need to archive daily or weekly. But typically what we see is that monthly, should suffice in most normal circumstances, but really depends on the volume of data. Frequency and methods of access to data exceeding online retention time. Like I explained before, if you are frequently accessing archive data, that is a problem and you should extend the residency time. Methods of access, so that was you have standard access to archive data available from within SAP. You also may require some archive enabling some development to certain key reports or transactions that you may want to read from the archive. So there may be a few circumstances like that. Authorization access or restrictions to archive data relative to online. So typically the authorization model is the same within the online database as the archive. So if you can't view a particular data for, let's say, a certain company code, when it gets archived, you would have the same definition there. Authorization, so end users who need to access archive data will require additional authorizations to grant them access to view archive data. And whoever is executing the archiving runs would need the specific authorizations to be able to run the jobs, monitor the jobs, etc. Consolidation of archiving runs by group where practical. Again, you could consolidate runs by company code, plant, sales org, purchasing org, depending on what you're archiving. And I really think that also ties to the long-term retention. Do they have different retention times? That's why you would want to consolidate your archiving runs by different groups. Also by restricting the size. You may need to restrict the size of the archive files themselves from a processing time so they fit in your runtime windows as well. So you may want to consider that. Data volumes can be challenging to archive programs, especially if you haven't archived before and you're trying to archive large volumes of data. The archive programs are going to take longer to complete, and that could be a challenge. So we need to then further restrict the volumes of data which we're archiving, and that in turn will make the process longer. So these are some of the key considerations that we wanted to highlight here for both process teams and technical teams. So now we want to kind of focus on the first step of an archiving project. And typically the first step is to perform a database analysis or an assessment of your overall system. That consists of analysis of customers' SAP systems for determination of data management targets, and also to determine potential archive yields, meaning how much can we archive out of the system, and what is that volume look like. Some of the lower level steps as part of the analysis would be to perform that database analysis against your top tables and indexes greater than 1 GB typically, just to try to look at all of your top tables. You have huge volumes of tables out there, so we want to kind of restrict it a little bit. We look at the top tables by size. We are also looking at fast growing tables. So we want to identify which tables they may be a little bit smaller in size, but they're growing rapidly. We look at the top tables and the indexes by size for total data consumption. When you perform archiving, it archives the data in the tables and deletes the data in the indexes. So when we're looking at overall volume of data that can be archived, you need to look at both the tables and the indexes. We also look at custom tables. So Z tables aren't ignored. They can be included in some cases as part of your standard archive object definition. Most cases, most customers would create a custom archive object for that table, or simply create a data deletion program for that table. So it really depends on if you need to archive the data versus simply delete the data. Then the final step is to map those top tables and indexes to a specific archive object and other data management methods. So not everything we're talking about here is a data archive object. It could be a data deletion program or some other method to remove the data. After we do that high-level process and finally map all the tables and indexes to archive objects, then we want to perform table-specific analysis against the key tables for each of the archive objects. What that does is it highlights the distribution across times by key fields per table. That will help show potential archiving yields for the top archiving object. Then the final step is to build an archive strategy and provide solution options. The archive strategy would be a breakdown of archiving and data management targets into manageable phases. Archiving phases shouldn't be, one phase where you try to archive the whole system. There's a limited number of background processes in the system. You can only run a certain number of data archiving runs at one time anyway. So really, it makes most sense to have multiple phases with, let's say, 3 to 5 archive objects as part of one phase. And then also, as part of the recommendation, the phases and the order of the archiving is important, because certain archive objects have to be run in a particular sequence. And especially true from the SD perspective. So we sequence the archive objects, we provide phases for the archive objects, typically starting with a quasi-technical phase, sort of quick wins, low-hanging fruit, and then jump more into the transactional data for your main modules. This is a look at the top tables. This is just an example, and the process of then mapping that to data management methods. So this is just a representation of that. Here are your tables or segments on one side. We also look at lob segments as well. So we have to look at the contents of those lob segments to identify what data is within those lob segments. As mentioned before, we look at the total size of the table and the indexes, and then we map the table to a particular archive object. Kind of sounds easy, but what's difficult is there are a large number of tables, for example, COEP, that have multiple archive objects tied to it. So we have to look at the table specifically look at the source of the data or where the data is originating from, and from there determine, okay, to archive data out of COAP, it could be a combination of the CO item archive object for cost center line items. It may have project data in there or WBS data. I would use the PS project object for it, etc. So it's not as simple as it looks. This example of the archive object chart, so sort of one of the deliverable that comes after an archive assessment. So it's broken out by area. In this case, these are your quasi-technical objects. And then we look at financial, non-tax relevant data, because again, if you're starting a project, you may not have a tax audit solution in place. So you don't want to kind of start off and archive, recent financial accounting document data in phase one, because you're going to need to focus also on your from a tax audit perspective and make sure that that gets implemented, either DART, TJC, etc. So that's the thinking here with this implementation. Then we jump into COPA and CO related data, start to think about tax and get that implemented. And then we jump into tax relevant data, FI document, material documents, POs, sales orders, billing docs, etc. So this is just an example of a chart that gets created after doing a complete analysis. Part of the archiving project process, what we want to do is make sure that we have a structured approach and a documented approach that's repeatable time and time again. And that really comes down to methodology that's used. So SolutionXchg consultants use the same methodology over and over again that has key controls in it, reporting mechanisms to track progress, mechanisms to perform gap analysis, etc., all to reduce the impact or negative results after the project is done. So the key steps here, obviously, first, build a project team, technical preparation, customizing of the archive objects, and setting up the whole infrastructure where you're archiving the data, your backend storage, etc. Prototyping is an important phase that can determine, you would use that for demo purposes to the client. You're going to determine runtime metrics, identify data quality issues, etc. in that prototype phase. Functional analysis, looking at your business processes, etc., identifying what retrieval methods you're going to require to read from the archive. And then really kind of focusing on gap identification and gap resolution before sign off. So this is our structured approach. There's more to it than I explained, but it's all based on ensuring that there is limited impact after the data gets archived. And so we follow this consistently.
Thank you very much, Dave. Let me say a little bit about the SolutionXchg expertise. We are supporting your organization with everything from business process analysis to SAP module customizing for specific modules. We do project management, enterprise content management, which is really our forte. We have been working in the enterprise content management area for some 20 plus years, and many more activities in supporting you, picking the right strategy for system basic tasks, system maintenance, document management tasks. And if we can go to the next forward one step, Dave, then we are getting to the question, but I was wondering if there were some graphics there. But Yeah, so if you have any questions for us, please post those in the questions panel. If you want to contact us afterwards, please send us an email to either me, you see my email address here on the screen, or to my business partner, Kristen Gerling. I'll be happy to arrange a one-on-one conversation with Dave to answer all your questions. And we do have a couple of questions, Dave, that I would like to explore right now. Question number one would be, why is data archiving before an S/4HANA migration so important?
Right. So I think the first slide covered that pretty clearly. It really comes down to cost. So the smaller of the footprint that you have within your environment, your SAP environment, the lower the cost will be. Plus, you know, if you're going through this process, you also have the added benefit of what in general archiving provides: some performance improvements, compliantly storing your archiving data, streamlining your system, etc. So it's always good to do archiving. Yes, if you're going to be moving to HANA, that really is going to make you want to look at archiving a lot more aggressively, and to get an archiving project and plan in place as soon as possible.
And if I get going with my data archiving project, how do I set realistic expectations within my organization?
Great, good question. Well, number one, you still need to follow your corporate retention policies and retain information online to support business, audit, and legal needs. So you really can't go in as so overly aggressive and try to archive everything, because you still have to follow the policies, and you still need to retain data within your environment to support business, audit, and legal needs. Another point would be that performance will improve after you go through your archiving and do a reorg within your system, a reorg of the tables in which you archive, and rebuilding of your indexes. But it may not be as drastic of a performance improvement. So it will generally improve, but it may not be as drastic as you think. Other key data management strategies are also important, like summarization of data and data avoidance as well. They should also be looked at and investigated, which will help your overall data management strategy.
And last but not least, who should be involved in a typical data archiving project? Okay.
So there are multiple resources who need to be involved in a data archiving project. Not all of them, or I would say from the client perspective, not all of them need to be full-time resources spending all their time working on archiving, but really at key milestones and certain points within a project, their roles will increase. Obviously, number one, a project manager on the client side who fully understands the organization with some SAP knowledge is critical. Somebody who knows all the players and can help keep the project on track, knows the key players so that he can bring those resources in for workshops, for functional user testing, etc. So that's a critical resource. A second level of resources, more from a technical perspective, would be basis team resources to help set up the overall infrastructure, DBAs, and also developers in case you need to do any archive enabling of transactions or things of that nature. Also, the next level of resources would be key end users, super users, decision makers. So when we have these workshops and these discussions to identify gaps and to explain how the archiving works, that back and forth discussion is critical. So having the right users who understand the business in the room, working with your project team, then you'll limit the issues that may occur afterwards. Also, throughout the process, you need to consult with your legal and audit representatives. You may have legal holds on data. You need to understand your corporate retention policies and work with that team. Working with audit, obviously from like tax audit perspective, internal audits, you need to bring them into the fold and get their input to the project. Also would need to identify an archive administrator, somebody who's going to execute the archiving runs and monitor the runs on an ongoing basis. And the final resource would be potentially bringing in an archive consultant, like consultants at solutionXchg, who have the experience and the knowledge to get your project moving faster, push it through the process, limit the gaps and the issues that can occur if you're going to attempt to implement this project on your own.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dave. Great presentation. I really look forward to hear from some of our customers on how they go about their project and their experience with moving to S/4HANA. This concludes the webinar for today. I hope everyone has enjoyed all the good information and got some good takeaways from our presentation. Again, Dave, thank you very much. And everybody, until next time, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.